To everybody who just joined us, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to give my little community engagement speech one more time, and that'll give us an extra minute for folks to filter in, but we have so much to cover with this conversation. We really want to get started as close to 1 o'clock as possible. My name's Sarah Robinson. I'm the Senior Project Manager for Reaching Higher New Hampshire, and you are attending the New Hampshire Alliance for College and Career Readiness Higher Education panel. We have some wonderful guests joining us today, which the Alliance's Executive Director, Nicole Heimarck, will introduce to you. Because this is a webinar, we have disengaged the chat feature, but there is Q&A option. So please, as questions come up, send them to us and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of the presentation where we've allowed time for Q&A. This presentation is also being recorded, so it'll be available to you on our website after the fact. So thank you for choosing to be with us this afternoon. And thank you for letting me assist in moderating, Nicole. And it is 1:01. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Terrific. Thank you, Sarah. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and happy Wednesday. We are pleased to welcome you all to the New Hampshire Alliances for College and Career Readiness Higher Education Roundtable, where we're going to be exploring state, regional, and national trends in higher education policy, workforce development issues, barriers to access and possible solutions, and then, of course, a hot topic at this moment here in New Hampshire, institutional consolidations and mergers. But to begin, I want to offer some background information on the New Hampshire Alliance, give a picture, sort of a broad landscape of some metrics and numbers on higher education here in New Hampshire, and then introduce our esteemed panelists. So to begin, I really want to highlight the New Hampshire Alliance for College and Career Readiness, which is a special project that sits within Reaching Higher New Hampshire. We are a public policy support center, and the Alliance itself is a network of collaborators, both grass tops and grassroots leaders who connect on higher ed and post-secondary learning opportunities on the K-12 spectrum and thereafter. And we engage K-12, post-secondary ed, business and industry, and the nonprofit sector. So it's a real commitment of a diverse group of stakeholders in aiming to support New Hampshire's youth as they gain information and make choices about post-secondary pursuits. Going a little deeper on the New Hampshire Alliance itself, our mission is really to foster an environment where all Granite Staters recognize the value of college and career readiness. And we really try to elevate that recognition and engagement through communications, through policymaking efforts, and really the coordination of our network and our collaborators across all sectors. But in terms of what we believe, specifically our core guiding principles, first and foremost, the New Hampshire Alliance believes in a very broad view of college readiness, where students can pursue really a wide variety of pathways that lead to a range of career options. We also believe in empowering both students and families with knowledge so they can make the most well-informed decisions about their future. And really today's engagement is a step in that direction in terms of building a collective knowledge around higher education policy, opportunities, and really challenges that we face in the current ecosystem. We believe that the celebration of student success drives change in this space, and that local innovation and cross-sector partnerships are key to that student success. And then lastly, we believe that good data drives the best decisions in post-secondary education. So that gives you a brief orientation to who we are, what our mission is, what we're committed to as a collective of collaborators, and then more importantly, our guiding principles and why we're engaged in this dialogue today. Segueing a bit to some New Hampshire data, and I'm sure many folks on this call are not a stranger to some of the data, particularly enrollment data and post-secondary data we've been tracking here in New Hampshire. The New Hampshire Alliance, one of the deliverables for the public and policymakers is really to track good, solid data and present it in a way that's easily understood. And one key piece of data to today's discussion is around high school enrollment. And we've looked at high school enrollment trends over a 10-year period between 2009 and 2019. And we see in that 10-year period, students enrolled in grades 9 through 12, so high school enrollment in our public schools and our public chartered schools is down about 14% statewide. Now, this is not unique to New Hampshire. These trends are being tracked both regionally here in New England, as well as nationally. But you can see the Alliance has also gone a step further to really dig into what those enrollment trends look by county. And I would direct folks' attention to Hillsborough County, Rockingham County, and Coos County here in New Hampshire. In Hillsborough County alone, we've seen a 16% decline in high school enrollment. And I want to remind everybody, that's our most populous county here in New Hampshire, where a third of all New Hampshire high school enrollment exists. And then when we look right next door to Rockingham County, we actually see the lowest decline statewide in enrollment, and we see about a quarter of our high school population resides in that county. And then when we go up to the northernmost section of our state and really rural locations in our state, we see a very significant student decline in high school enrollment, which is down about 28%. So I think this sort of paints a picture for us that enables us to engage in a conversation today, especially in what we're going to hear from our national, state, and regional experts on post-secondary education and trends we're tracking. To continue with some of this data, we then extrapolate high school enrollment to college enrollment. And the Alliance has been tracking this over a number of years. And for the purposes of today's dialogue, I would really draw folks' attention to the orange line, which is the second line from the top on this line graph. And this line speaks to the percentage of students each year graduating from high school who enroll in a post-secondary learning experience and in college enrollment. And as recent as 2018, New Hampshire was tracking about 58% of its graduates enrolling in college. As a point of comparison, the regional average, so the New England average in that same time period was 66%, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. And then since 2009, New Hampshire has been below the national and regional averages in college enrollment. So another really important indicator we want to be aware of and a trend that we're tracking here within our state borders. And then the next and sort of final data element that I'm gonna engage folks in offering this landscape view of New Hampshire is persistence. And this is another common metric tracked by states, particularly in workforce development matters, along with post-secondary institutions. And persistence really tries to capture those students who continue in their programs, and it's measured by enrollment in the first semester of their second year of their program. So what this is showing us is for those kids who enroll in programs initially, how many of them continue with their program into their second year. And you can see The New England average here is 85%, and the New Hampshire average over the years has been around 82%. So another trend that we're tracking and thinking about state workforce development issues in students acquiring certificates, credentials, and degrees of value so that they can earn a livable income and be a contributing member of our communities and of our state. So that gives you a picture of what we're looking at in terms of trends, and in many ways, a reason why we've pulled this roundtable conversation together today. In thinking about the outcomes that we aim for today, the Alliance really has three broad outcomes. And the first relates directly to the policymaking environment that we are seeing and hearing about in the state of New Hampshire during this current legislative session. And I would argue over the last several years, we've seen a lot of policymaking efforts focused on post-secondary learning, post-secondary education. But the catch is we so often hear from the same voices. So probably our highest priority in terms of an outcome today is really to begin to grow and diversify those voices that are valued in this dialogue, and really engage a broader and a deeper audience in the future of higher education here in the Granite State. The second piece is this desire to expand our collective knowledge around higher education policy, the potential implications of policy decisions and recommendations, and really create the opportunity for a dialogue about both the benefits and risks to a variety of decisions. And then equally as important is to begin to move this conversation to one that places students and family at center, as opposed to institutions, really looking at student needs and what will benefit them and their families. So I am pleased to share that today we have a wonderful panel joining us, and I will provide more insightful introductions when we get to their designated time to speak. But we've pulled in Michael Turmelle from the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation to speak on state workforce development issues and access issues to post-secondary pathways. Brian Prescott, who really brings a national lens to the higher education policy landscape. And then Joyce Judy, who joins us from Vermont and can share experiences, direct experiences on college consolidations and merger efforts. So I'm going to close that introduction. I am going to stop my screen share and bring us to our actual panel discussion. And the first panelist we're going to be meeting with today is Michael Turmelle. And he's joining us from the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. Michael is the Director of Education and Career Initiatives at the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. In his role, Michael oversees education grant making, as well as the foundation's scholarship program. Each year, the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation awards more than $6 million in scholarships to New Hampshire students pursuing a variety of higher education pathways. And prior to joining the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, Michael worked both in higher education and K-12 public education for 26 years. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Nicole.
I want to begin, Michael, by really highlighting an important announcement that the Charitable Foundation offered last week. And that was their announcement of a gift to the class of 2021. And I'm hoping you can take some time today to tell us about that gift and really the motivation behind that gift.
Certainly, Nicole, and thank you very much for that introduction. And welcome to all of our guests who are joining us live and to those who will listen on later in a recorded fashion. As Nicole mentioned last week, about 1 week from today, the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, in partnership with the Foundation for the New Hampshire Community Colleges, announced a class gift to the high school graduating class of 2021 from New Hampshire schools. And that class gift is the gift of one free course of the students choosing at any one of the 7 New Hampshire community colleges for the fall term. And there are lots of reasons why we felt a good timing for this type of project. First and foremost, I want to thank our colleagues in Vermont for actually creating a similar project last year in their state, which helped meet students' needs at the very onset of the pandemic. And Nicole, in terms of what the motivation was for the class gift project, quite simply, we and many folks in New Hampshire are concerned that the high school graduating class for this year has endured up to 16 months of near constant disruption to both their junior and senior years of high school, the most pivotal time for career and post-secondary planning. And if you think about it, their experience over those 16 months and what life would have been like had the pandemic not struck, what you can see is that before the pandemic, a student experiencing the junior or senior years of high school would have developed a rigorous college preparatory coursework structure and laboratory experiences. They would have engaged in internships and other extended learning or work-based learning opportunities. They would have met with their school counselors and begun looking at college selection. They would have attended financial aid planning nights with their parents. They would have planned family trips for college visits and scheduled interviews with admissions officers. And they would have scheduled into their everyday life volunteer and service working opportunities to sort of bolster their resumes. And they would have participated in part-time or maybe in the summertime, even full-time employment to save money for their post-secondary studies. With the onset of the pandemic, all of that was placed in jeopardy. And what we're hearing is that this disruption has led many students to go off course, to not have solid plans for the fall. And this perfect storm, having knocked students off course, we're seeing that bear out in things like fewer students completing financial aid with federal financial aid forms, the FAFSA, lower numbers of students filing early decisions at colleges, fewer students applying for post-secondary scholarships, including at the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, and lower college enrollment overall. And so these troubling signs tell us students need some help to get back on track. And we're hoping that a project like this class gift project will help to inspire students who don't have a solid plan for the fall to take a step forward, meet with a community college advisor, and begin to chart out, yes, enroll in one course, but also take a look at what the opportunities might be to embark on a career pathway.
Thank you, Michael. So would it be fair to say really this gift to the class of 2021 that the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation has done in partnership with the Community College Foundation is really to elevate those students who don't have plans for next year? It's not for the students who have already submitted their deposits and are planning enrolling in a degree-bearing program next year. It's really intended for those students in our communities and in our states who don't have plans, but certainly have aspirations to continue their education.
Yes, that is true. However, we also know that every year we have what higher ed folks sometimes refer to as the summer melt. These are students that plan on attending a four-year institution in the fall, but something happens over the course of the summer to knock them off track. And those are the students who then don't show up for their, higher education experience in a four-year institution. So we do anticipate that there will be a number of students who believe that they have solid plans for the fall, who may have some change of plans that will necessitate sort of a redirection. And we want to make sure that every student who would like to take advantage of this program can take advantage of the program.
Okay, terrific. That's really an exciting opportunity. for students in this state who are graduating this year. If New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and the Community College Foundation were to play this out and look at sort of the overall impact, if you had a crystal ball 2, 3, maybe 4 years from now, what do you hope to see as the desired impact of this gift?
I think there are a number of potential outcomes, both short-term and long-term. On a short-term note, we would love to see a higher than normal enrollment in the community college system this fall. So we know historically roughly how many students matriculate directly from a New Hampshire high school and enter into a community college campus in the fall following their graduation. That number has been trending downward. And then you mentioned, Nicole, one of the factors is a natural factor, right? It's the fact that there are fewer young people. And so naturally there would be over time fewer people entering into the community college just because there are fewer high school seniors graduating. So there has been a downward trend, but certainly last year that downward trend spiked and we saw a relatively low number of students matriculating directly into a community college program following their high school graduation. That number fell from, within a couple of years' time from 17, almost 1,800 students to 1,300 students last year. So short term, we would love to see every student who doesn't have solid plans for the fall take advantage of this program. And as a consequence of that, we would hope to see more than 1,300 students participating in a community college course come the fall. I think long term, there are also some long-term ramifications if this program succeeds and we are able to connect young people with a career pathway in the community college system. We also may begin to address some of the workforce development issues we have in the state, where prior to the pandemic, we were looking at by the year 2025, the jobs available in the state in New Hampshire, almost 70% of them would require some sort of post-secondary training, whether it was a credential, a license, or an associate or bachelor's degree. There are signs that those numbers are still in play, that post-pandemic, the economy is recovering in New Hampshire, unemployment is down, and there are signs that our skilled workforce that we projected would be needed in 2025, even after the pandemic, that is still going to remain a factor. And so we're hoping to attract young people to good paying and resilient jobs right here in New Hampshire. And we'd love for our young folks to stay. I think that's a long-term goal.
Thank you for that, Michael. So when you first introduced the gift to the class of 2021, you spoke about the pandemic and specifically how the pandemic has impacted what would be typical and normal opportunities, normal planning opportunities for this year's graduating class. And we know that the pandemic has taken a toll on our nation's youth, on our state's youth, as well as young adults in our adult-aged population. I wonder, based on the work you've done, both in higher ed and the K-12 space, as well as your role at the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation right now, how should higher education institutions be rethinking their roles and responsibilities as states and the nation recover from the global health crisis?
Well, Nicole, I certainly know that many of the folks that I've spoken to in higher education are keenly aware of the demands, not only that they faced this past year, as they were themselves also offering sort of hybrid models in many cases. But I think the largest concern that should be addressed, or at least have woven into the conversation, is that the students that went through those education challenges in their junior and senior years of high school during the pandemic, those education challenges were deeply compounded by challenges within the household. So for example, while students were trying to do their schoolwork, many of them were dealing with ailing parents or grandparents. folks in their extended families who were ill. They were coping with unemployment and underemployment in their households. They were dealing with food insecurity. They were themselves, as high school seniors, perhaps having to step up within the family to offer childcare to younger siblings because childcare was not available. They were dealing with housing insecurity in some cases. All of those issues have caused deep and lasting impacts within those students, right? These challenges that students faced over the course of the past 16 months, those don't just stay in the student's hometown or in their household when they leave to go to college, right? Students take that with them. And I think one of the largest concerns is that we don't yet know what the long-term impacts of this pandemic and crisis has been or will be on these young people, right? We do know there's been a higher incidence of things like anxiety and depression exhibited among young people. We know, for example, that students will face issues when they go to college. How they deal with those issues and the resilience that they bring to those issues may be impacted by the pandemic. And so I think first and foremost, it's a recognition on the part of higher education that this year's graduating high school senior class may have a need for assistance in ways that other students have not in the past. And I think it's important for everyone on campus. I think it's sort of a all hands on deck. It's not just the role of an academic advisor, but everybody on campus needs to be on the lookout for troubling signs when a student might be in crisis or maybe experiencing some sort of challenge that could jeopardize their ability to continue with their studies. So I think first and foremost, that is the most critical component, is that we don't yet know what the long-term impacts from an emotional, a physical, social, emotional, mental health perspective. We don't know what the long-term impacts will be. And it's going to take a village within the higher education institution to keep an eye on these young people and to make sure that they get the assistance they need if troubling signs arise.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate how you bring the human element and really humanize what we're talking about, and bring it to the individuals and the people and students, and not just focus on the policy. I want to sort of pivot a little bit because I know you and I have shared conversations in the past, both formally and informally, about student access and equity issues. And I would love for you to share with us some insights on what are some of the most critical student barriers to pursuing post-secondary education that need to be addressed almost immediately.
Well, thank you, Nicole. Some of those barriers are certainly longer term issues around equity and access to opportunity that there is no short term fix for, right? So if you think about in terms of what we know puts a young person on a trajectory to post-secondary learning, we know that there are lots of parts to that recipe that have to be added to the mix in order for things to come out right. So, you know, when you think about some of the research that's been done, even within your own institution, Nicole, around the whole picture of education, we know that a student who's born into poverty, if they are experiencing issues around poverty at a younger age, they are less likely than, say, their third grade peers to be reading and doing math on grade level. That's a long-term issue around equity that needs to be addressed. We know, for example, that there's a structural lack of equity within the K-12 system on everything from the way schools are funded. So the level of education and quality of education in some cases, the breadth of the education that you're offered in New Hampshire can be limited by the zip code that you're born into. So we know there's a lack of equity in school funding. We also know, for example, that there are barriers that are very challenging, like teacher salary. If teacher salary is depressed in a community, teachers tend to leave after a period of time and move to a district that has higher paying salaries. So what you see is in districts that are, say, property poor or unable to raise as much capital, then have to depress the salary ranges of their teachers. And as a consequence, they have sort of a never-ending turnover of teachers where they're constantly trying to bring new teachers on board, train them at a higher cost of constant and ongoing professional development. And that churn continues where teachers come and leave the system. And that leads to a lack of consistency. So those are some of the sort of long range equity issues that I think our state needs to grapple with in order to address at least some of the barriers. But I do think that there are some barriers that can be immediately impacted in things, innovative practices like school districts working in partnership with higher education, with philanthropy, chambers of commerce, directly with businesses and industry to develop flexible pathways so that young people can experience different types of business and industries so that they can really learn about what interests them, what excites them about their learning, and they can begin at a young age, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade and on, to explore different types of career pathways so that by the time they get into the latter years of their high school experiences, they've already begun to acquire college credits, let's say, dual credits, high school and college. They've begun to experience work internships in the field that they want to study. They begin to build that resume and career interests that they take with them into their higher education. And in some cases, it would be fantastic if higher education would value those experiences and undertake, say, begin to look at students' work and study experiences before college and award college credits for college level work that happens outside of their walls. So those are, career pathways are certainly, the development of that mindset. I also think that, college affordability is a critical factor. And if you look at the demographics, Nicole, that you put up on screen of the number of young people plummeting in New Hampshire, well, that's compounded by the fact that in recent years, up to 60% of our students who are going on to study in a four-year school actually leave the state of New Hampshire to do that because it's more affordable to go out of state and to study in a four-year institution than it is to stay right here in New Hampshire and study. So college affordability, the development of different mindsets around career pathways and early college experiences, deeper ties between the K-12 and higher education worlds, I think are critical.
Thank you for that. So before we sort of formally end our conversation with you, Michael, you've mentioned career pathways a number of times. And I know for many of us in education, we're really familiar with that terminology, but could you offer sort of a description of what is meant, what is intended by career pathways for our listeners this afternoon?
Sure. And I want to just allay some of the fears when people hear career pathways and, hear of me talking about 5th, 6th, and 7th grade students. We're not talking about a scenario where a 5th grade student is placed onto a track to study a career pathway and they're locked onto that track. We're talking about flexible models for career exploration and developing experience in the field that emphasizes academic preparation, pre-service work experience, work study skill development and acquisition, a growth mindset of continual improvement and learning, and in some cases, earning, certainly in the high school age, dual credits. So the student, while they're doing this career pathway exploration, is earning high school credit, which can be used for graduation, and also post-secondary credits, so that the student also has an introduction to an institution of higher education where they can begin to explore higher education while they're still in high school. One of the things, Nicole, that keeps many of particularly our learners from low income backgrounds where they maybe have fewer social networks, one of the things that keeps them from exploring is the fact that they don't have anybody in their world that has post-secondary experience. So if you don't have a mom or a dad or an aunt or an uncle that can help you navigate that world of higher education, it's foreign to you. But if you can begin to explore that world of higher education while you're younger, say in high school, by taking a dual enrollment class where you're getting some career pathway or work experience, you now, if you have a good experience with that, say community college course or trade school course, or public institution of higher education course, you now know that you can do college work. You know that university is something that's within your reach and something that you can handle academically and socially. So it's that, it's one of those things that we can do for our young folks who don't have that leg up, to give them some early exposure, and it helps with the aspiration, which is a huge part of sort of the opportunity gap. Some students just simply don't aspire to higher education because it's not within their worldview. If you can bring that worldview to them at a younger age, it expands their horizons.
So I think that is a marvelous place to bookend this conversation with you and really highlight, just like adults who are in careers, those networks, those social networks are so critical to student success, particularly our students who are living in conditions of poverty. I'm hoping you're going to be able to stay on the line with us, Michael, as we do have one common question that we want to ask of all of our panelists today, but I think we're going to tuck that in at the end. And
Okay.
At this moment, I think we're going to segue to Brian Prescott right now. And I see Brian coming on the screen. I want to offer a brief introduction on Brian, and we really tapped into Brian to bring sort of a national voice and a national expertise to this conversation we're having this afternoon. But Brian Prescott is the Vice President at the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems. And on this call, we're going to call it NCHMS because it's a mouthful. And he leads there and supports projects on behalf of states, state agencies, and systems related to state strategic planning, post-secondary finance and affordability, governance and organization, demographics, and student success and workforce outcomes. And I think all of those items sort of hit on what Michael just shared with us from the New Hampshire view. Prior to coming to NCHMS in 2016, Brian spent 11 plus years in a similar role at the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, WICCE, where his work included authorship of 2 editions of WICCE's widely used state-by-state projections on high school enrollments. Again, a really important topic here in New Hampshire. He also currently serves as a member of the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center's Board of Directors. That is, the New Hampshire Alliance uses that resource quite often to look at data, and he holds a PhD in higher education from the University of Virginia. So welcome, Brian. We are thrilled you're able to join us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Of course.
Here being virtual, of course.
Yes. So given your expertise in enrollment trends specifically, what are some of the most pressing enrollment issues you are monitoring in the higher education space today?
Well, obviously, you did an outstanding job outlining some of the data that show the predicament that New Hampshire is in. But I would add that New Hampshire's, almost like you said, it's just it's experiencing more acute version of some problems that are either currently present in other states or most other states in the nation are going to see this enrollment cliff hit in 2026. That's going to increase competition for traditional age undergraduates. And increasingly, since it's also a regional problem for New England, it will potentially lead to some additional strain on the institutional financial challenges that are being felt already right now, given the degree to which there's mobility in New England across state lines and the unusually heavy extent to which public institutions in particular in New Hampshire and Vermont rely on tuition revenue to support operational costs. That makes the need to recruit students even more acute under any circumstances, and a demographic decline such as the one that you're likely to see for high school graduates is a real challenge. And add to that the uncertainty created by the pandemic. We would expect students to, and that was not evenly felt by institutions of different types, of course, but certainly there were some enrollment impacts from the pandemic, and it's unclear how enrollment patterns might return, whether they'll return to what they were before or be different in some way. I would add, though, that the post-secondary needs in New Hampshire is not confined to the traditional pipeline. And our analysis suggests that notwithstanding the hard work that the community colleges and the other institutions do, the state ranks near or at the bottom of states in the extent to which it enrolls adult learners in the state. Reaching out to those students is going to be quite different than the traditional age high school students, but it's a relatively, at least in comparison to other institutions or other states, it's an untapped marketplace.
Okay, that's a really interesting observation. So given these challenges and these demographic shifts, and I think you just touched on this slightly, what solutions and innovations are you noticing that effectively and sustainably begin to address some of these challenges?
Sure. So let me start by saying the 2009 to 2019 data that you showed earlier, I think were great framing for this conversation. But I would add to that a little bit more history and go all the way back to the early 90s, because from the early 90s through about 2012 or so, in some places and a little bit later in others, states across the country were able to count on an every year, single year-over-year increase in the number of high school graduates those states were producing. And the reason I bring that up is because that's nearly 2 decades of growth. A lot of things become standard operating procedure under those conditions that don't work very well in this new era that we're entering, where that population of students that has historically formed the basis of our enrollments is no longer continuing to grow, is actually declining. So this is so finding solutions is something that loads of people are trying to do, but it has to be recognized that it's not easy, and it's even worse for organizations like higher education that are not necessarily known as the most nimble that are out there because of the way in which we value tradition, we have long-term employment, and so on. But I would say that the solutions that you need to be thinking about in New Hampshire have to be tailored to New Hampshire and its needs. So I'm not prepared to provide any particular specific ones, but there are some criteria that I think are useful to be mindful of. That is that solutions need to really prioritize relevancy and programs that meet workforce needs. That means new programs, but it also in existing programs, it has to do with trying to find ways to embed the kinds of skills that employers are looking for in existing curricula and existing programs. A second is really putting students and their needs at the center of the educational experience in ways that we haven't had to do because it's been a buyer's market before, a seller's market before. And that includes what I was talking about before, outreach to adults, different kinds of appeals to their needs, making adjustments in the time and place and flexibility and delivery modes related to the education that meets the students' needs better. And then figuring out ways to recognize their actual learning in new and different ways, improving access to mobility and so forth. A couple of more things, just a few more things. One is, given the demographic trends and the high costs already in New Hampshire, I would imagine that any solution has to come along with some cost savings from in higher education. That doesn't necessarily mean less cost to the state, but it means less cost to the students and better affordability or reallocation of resources to improve post-secondary outcomes. And then finally, I think when you think about that 20-year trend and the changes that we need to see, is more systems level thinking about solutions. And so that means we don't expect institutions to sort of go after all these problems each independently on their own, but being mindful of mission differentiation and the need to fit institutional missions into local contexts, and capitalize on the strengths of those institutions, and then really meeting that moment by finding ways for institutions to collaborate more than compete, which has been the standard practice in the past. And that includes collaborations that are not easy, but relatively easy around administrative consolidations and shared services. And then the much harder ones around academic program sharing that are difficult to really work on and to do well.
Okay, thank you for that. So in thinking from a higher education institutional perspective, and really trying to put students at center, what are the greatest barriers to students in pursuing post-secondary pathways? And how do we begin to address some of these barriers? And I know Michael, spoke to a number of these, but we really want to weave in sort of the national perspective on this issue that you've been tracking.
I think unaffordable costs is one obvious answer, and weak preparation. Those are sort of the twin pillars of barriers that really get in the way. And then there's the whole host of additional issues that Michael was describing that exacerbate those kinds of things. Dual enrollment is one way to try to help address at least the second half. Well, in both cases, really. Then there's the opportunity costs of enrolling in college and making the case to students and the failure to appreciate the value proposition of higher education generally. This is something I don't know the degree to which it's a problem in New Hampshire, but we see it in other states. I'll give you the most obvious example. In Wyoming, students are attracted into the oil and gas industry because of high wages. They get stuck in jobs that they can't advance from in those, and then boom and bust cycles affect them. But at the moment they're making those decisions, and even for students that are enrolled, they're often dragged away or attracted away from their post-secondary education pursuits. So just to sort of describe the opportunity costs, and I think a lack of shorter-term programs with clear and relatively quick payoffs in the labor market is a barrier to sort of making part of that case. And of course, inflexible delivery. So you're going to have to take classes at 8:30 and then at 2:30 on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or whatever it is, doesn't necessarily meet the needs of a lot of students that are there. So
could you share with us, I'm really intrigued by your point around the shorter term programs that potentially reap robust outcomes for students. Can you share for our listeners, some examples of what you've seen or what you have in mind there?
So I think that these are programs that would have to fit very tightly into the New Hampshire workforce needs and economy, so that there's a clear link between those programs and the payoff. And so, but the other part of it is that they need to be stackable, so that a student can begin a program like that, get the credential has a payoff, and then they have a way to layer those programs in to the next credential or degree that they need. And so there are programs around information technology and healthcare that are laddered relatively well, that I think are appropriate ways to think about trying to think about those arrangements as well.
Okay, great. Thank you for those concrete examples. So something here that the Alliance has been deeply passionate about is putting students at the center of this conversation. And, it's our sense there hasn't been much student voice involved in sort of the policymaking realm and some of the proposals that are emerging on higher education here in New Hampshire. So I'm wondering, really from a student perspective, how can institutions approach mergers or consolidations in a way that involve future planning beyond just sort of a state mandate or the vitality of the institution itself, but really ensures that the decisions they're making benefit the students first?
Well, that's a great question, and quite often this notion of mergers is one of the kinds of things it's often discussed in the dark because it's very sensitive, and there are good reasons to sort of begin those conversations with some caution. I think that a merger, to begin with, let me characterize that we've done some work on trying to provide some information about the merger proposal that was on the table in New Hampshire. And I want to distinguish the fact that this is a merger proposal that is of systems, not of institutions. And there's a systems merger there are fewer of those examples out there, and they are incredibly complex. They are often quite a bit more complex than institutional mergers. And so the cases that we identified for New Hampshire were in Alaska, Connecticut, and Minnesota, and they span years. Any merger of systems and even of institutions is going to have some significant disruptive impacts. And those disruptions are going to be, whether or not the merger is a good or a bad idea in the long term. In the short term, they're going to create some disruption. And it's likely that the institutions and their leadership's attention will shift focus away from student success orientation and towards trying to manage the implementation of the merger, worry about where their positions are likely to go in the end, and so forth. So there has to be this recognition of that. Often the mergers or restructuring is being pursued for reasons of organizational stress. The governance model is misaligned in some way with the state's political leadership's interests, or it's intended to try to generate cost savings, as has been part of the argument for the one in New Hampshire that's been put on the table. Ultimate and cost savings are a way in which you can meet students' needs where they are, because there's these affordability concerns. But there needs to be something more beneficial towards students that is part of that. And I have heard that the New Hampshire proposal talks about trying to smooth student pathways as one of the motivators for the merger in play that's been put in place. And certainly that's been a common objective of other efforts like this that we found. Whether or not it still remains a significant undertaking to do that. So we would encourage, particularly in a state like New Hampshire that's seeing these kinds of population trends, that additional benefits for students be put on the table as a payoff for the merger. I think President Judy, when she speaks, may talk about some of the kinds of things that we've been working on in Vermont around that, but it includes providing access to programs that's in parts of the state that students might otherwise not be able to access because of the declining population and the need and the inability to fund full programs in some places. But again, a systems level thinking can try to help address some of those gaps that are likely to emerge as the population reality set in.
So I wonder, in thinking about this systems level thinking and student voice and making decisions in the best interest of students and families, have you seen any mergers or consolidations, whether at the systems level or the institutional level, that engage student voice in those conversations?
I think that well, the short answer to that question is it's not something I've looked closely at in terms of the extent to which students are brought into the rooms where these conversations are occurring. In Pennsylvania, what they're going through now, there's a student member of the Board of Governors and student members of the institutional boards of trustees as they start to merge those institutions, and that provides a channel for a student voice to be heard in those conversations. And so there are approaches that rely on the existing governance model. There are in the Georgia cases of mergers, which lots of policymakers have looked to for inspiration, there have been efforts to try. There's been documented improvements in some of the student services, but that's because of the reallocation of resources that has gone to provide additional supports to students. And the justification for the mergers was never exclusively or even primarily around rescuing institutions that were on the brink of financial difficulties, which is a distinct difference between what the conversations have been like in other states that matters considerably.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you for that clarification. So it is clear to both our team and listeners, I'm sure, that you've done a lot of work in state consolidations or mergers or long-term planning. And I wonder, before we bookend this conversation, if you can share some characteristics of successful mergers or consolidations that you've seen that perhaps New Hampshire could learn from, or maybe even mistakes that were made that New Hampshire should be cautious of.
Well, I'm happy to do so. Let me start by saying that let me distinguish the notion of mergers from a broader term, consolidations, and argue that there are that it's useful to think first, given the level of disruption that a formal merger creates, and some of the challenges that extend beyond that around accreditation and all sorts of other things, that consolidation of functions may be an approach that's shy of a merger, less disruptive, but accomplishes some of the same goals. And so you think about what those functions are, whether they're administrative functions like procurement or human resources or whatever, and you think about some of the academic functions around program delivery, and think about ways in which multiple institutions could work together to deliver those services or educational delivery models that doesn't require them each to sort of build the whole infrastructure themselves. So I'd say that, but I think that there are some lessons that we can draw from the experiences that other states have had. To begin with, a clear and compelling justification for why merging or consolidating institutions or functions for that matter is important. A really thorough understanding of the assets in place, as well as the challenges that all of that's grounded in data and evidence that you can share with the public and with the affected stakeholders is really important. A deep stakeholder engagement to give them voice. There's faculty throughout the state of Vermont and New Hampshire, in Pennsylvania, that are thinking about these issues with expertise and also some very legitimate, in some cases, concerns about this. And so having an open dialogue is important. We found that external validation and an external point of view has helped from time to time to bring some of this comparison stuff, but also to introduce an entity to facilitate some of these dialogues that doesn't that doesn't have the direct impacts on them of the end result. So that not having a dog in the fight in the same way sometimes is helpful. It really takes leadership and political will to get somewhere on this process, and oftentimes that requires state people external to the post-secondary setting, like business leaders, to help push the conversation forward and ensure that attention is on it. There's a need generally to spend money, to save money. Consolidating systems is going to cost a considerable amount of money to merge the back office IT, the student services function, figure out how to accommodate differences in policies and so forth. A deliberate pace is really important, one that's not too hasty, but also one that isn't dragged out super long either. And then finally, there needs to be some set of metrics for success. How do you know when you're successful on this? What's the target? How is it realistic? How are you going to measure it? All of those things, I think, are useful ingredients to a process that will have the shortest possible disruptive impact and the most likely outcomes to meet those needs that were identified, those purposes that were identified at the outset.
Thank you for that, Brian. I think all of those characteristics and items you just highlighted are really relevant to the conversations here in New Hampshire, and hopefully continue beyond this roundtable today. I'm hoping you're able to stay with us until the 2:30 point. As I shared, we have one common question we want to ask all our participants, but at this moment, we're going to segue to Joyce Judy, our third and final panelist, who is joining us from our twin state in Vermont. And a little bit of background on Joyce. Joyce Judy has been the president of the Community College of Vermont, CCV, since 2009. A special focus of her work is on expanding access to higher education for all Vermonters, from high school students taking college courses to adult students seeking new career opportunities. She has overseen the development of a broad number of workforce education initiatives and has been a statewide leader in increasing the number of students who continue with their education after high school. By expanding CCV's relationship with the philanthropic community, Judy has achieved significant growth in private support for CCV initiatives, including several scholarship programs, the Introduction to College and Career course to improve college-going rates of Vermont high school students, and enhanced services to veteran and military students. So welcome, Joyce. We are thrilled to have you with us today.
Thank you, Nicole. It's such a pleasure to be here.
And I really want to begin. Brian did a nice job of hinting to some of the work that's underway in Vermont right now. And I wonder if you can begin telling us about Vermont's story in consolidating higher education, and how did Vermont really get to that point?
Thank you. And I'd be happy to sort of describe where we are. I want to do two things. One, I just want to give a shout out to Brian. Brian and NCHEMS were really instrumental in helping Vermont get to where we are today. They just are really, really good, thoughtful. They come with a lot of expertise, and they have been their voice has been incredibly well received in Vermont. So I just want to, it was wonderful that you brought him in, but I think he also comes with a lot of experience. And so thank you for that. The other thing I just want to also say right up front is that, you asked me to come and talk about Vermont's story. And I want to be really clear that we are in the really early stages. We have made some progress and we're moving forward, but we have a plan. Now the hard work of implementation is really underway. And so I just want to make sure that I'm not coming here, people thinking I'm an expert. I can just tell you where we are on the journey. So I will start by saying, sort of describing how Vermont got to where we are today. And I think just to start as a little bit of a background, the Vermont's higher ed entity is organized a little bit different than New Hampshire. And I grew up in New Hampshire, so I was very familiar with the university, Plymouth, Keene, then the community college system was separate and distinct. In Vermont, the University of Vermont is separate, and then there's the Vermont State College system, which is made up of 3 residential schools: Northern Vermont University, Castleton State University, and Vermont Technical College, and then Community College of Vermont. So there's 4 schools within what has been known as the Vermont State College system. For the past, I would say 5 years or more, each of the 3 residential schools have gone through periods of really, they've struggled financially. Sometimes they've rebounded, sometimes, but there's been a period of time when there's been some significant financial struggles. And I would say that last spring, the Vermont State Colleges entered a period where there was a significant financial crisis. We were really at a critical point. What was hard about all of this is the Community College of Vermont was fine financially and very solid, but because we are part of the entire system, we were lumped together. So I will just name that as president of the college, that's been hard because we have figured out how to manage our way through this. But so last spring, the system was entering a pretty significant financial crisis. And so at the time, our chancellor, Jeb Spalding, put together a plan. And he had been very clear with the legislature, and his predecessors had been clear, because, you know, New Hampshire and Vermont duke it out for 49th or 50th in support to higher education every year. And so we suffer some of the same challenges that New Hampshire does. And so all the previous chancellors, including Jeb Spalding, talked to the legislature about the financial situation. And, you know, I think there was a feeling that, yeah, this is just sort of the same. Yes, you have a financial situation. Yes, tuition is too high, but we don't have more money to distribute to the system. But it was, but from Jeb's point of view, he felt like we were in, no, this is different this time. And so he actually put forward a public plan that called for the closing of 3 campuses. He proposed to close Northern Vermont University entirely, and to close the Vermont Technical College campus in Randolph. And so he announced that, and I will tell you that there was an amazing public outcry. You know, there were demonstrations in Montpelier. There was a lot of backlash. And so the legislature came forward and sort of pushed pause on that plan. And as a result of that, they also they committed to finding temporary funding to at least keep the system going for another year. And also at the same time, Jeb Spalding resigned. So there was a lot of turmoil going on. And in addition to the legislature committing to finding funding, they also agreed that to create a legislative committee and the charge was called the Select Committee on the Future of the Vermont State College System. And it really was focused on trying to look at how do you develop a financially viable, innovative system that would serve Vermont and Vermont businesses and have a bright future. And so, as you know, because of the pandemic, the Vermont legislature also agreed to adjourn in June, and then they were reconvening in the fall. Mm-hmm. But before they adjourned in the fall, in June, they actually passed this law to create this commission, and they also directed the Joint Fiscal Office to develop an RFP for a consultant, because in addition to creating a committee to look at this, they wanted a consultant. That's where NCHEMS came in. And over the summer, developed the RFP. We had a lot of interest in responding to the RFP, and a consulting group was hired at the end of August. And why I mention this is because the timeline was so fast. So the consultants were hired in September, and the charge was that we needed to deliver our first plan by December, the first part of December. So we had September, October, November to pull together this legislative committee, which was, the composition was named in the legislation. There were 15 people, but it was, a few legislators, business people, students, faculty. There were a number of representatives, and I was asked by the legislative leadership and the governor's office to chair the committee. So I think that's why I'm here today. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting because I came to that as the chair of the group, but I also wore a community college hat, and I was also part of the Vermont State College System. So it was an interesting professional development assignment, as many of you know, when you wear a lot of different hats. There was the Select Committee on the Future of Higher Education that was formed, and we met monthly. And we also developed a steering committee that met every other week. And we met with the consultants. So we chose, after a very competitive process, we chose NCHEMS, which is the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, which I'm sure you covered when you introduced Brian. And Brian was named as the lead consultant to work with us. So we had to develop a report that would really give the legislature and the governor's office some guidance by early December. And there were a couple things that we agreed to early on. One is that this had to be the legislature's plan, not our plan, not the Vermont State College's plan, so every other week I met with legislative leadership about where we were in this planning process starting in September. I also met every other week with the governor's office because we needed to make sure there was buy-in and that there were no surprises. In addition to NCHEMS, we also had NEBI, the New England Board of Higher Education, offered to support us, and they convened multiple focus groups. So there were focus groups from business entities to students to labor groups. I think they convened 11 focus groups and really heard from people what they would hope to see in a viable Vermont State Colleges, what programs and services that they needed. And also they continued and they did more focus groups after we developed and produced our first plan. And so in early December, we did meet our deadline. And we submitted a report, and this was huge credit to Brian and NCHEMS for getting us to that point. And the plan that we produced really provided guardrails at a pretty high level of what we needed to work on for the Vermont State Colleges. And we produced it in December because the governor prepares his budget in December, and we wanted it to influence the governor's budget. So it was quite an interesting process. And I will say that the governor's office, the legislature, and the Vermont State Colleges Board of Trustees has endorsed the plan. We fine-tuned the plan, a second plan in February, and our final plan was submitted to the appropriate groups in early April. But the December plan really established what we thought the work should be. So I'm going to stop there and I will answer more questions, but that sort of gives you where we went from a crisis to being very methodical about a plan and making sure that there was communication and that people had a lot of input.
Yes, you hit beautifully both on the history and the process itself, which I think is so helpful to the dialogue here in New Hampshire. I have so many questions, but one that I'm going to center on is this issue of timing and time frame, because you've brought it up and Brian brought it up in his conversation immediately before you. And I know Vermont had a really consolidated timeline, having the commission come together in August with a December timeline. That's pretty rapid fire. That's rapid movement. And Brian spoke about how you have to sort of balance, sort of this quick, steady pace with not pushing things forward too fast, but you can't drag it out too much. So I'm wondering if you can share thoughts on the time frame that you had as the leader of this work, of the planning work itself, and really some lessons in thinking about that timeline.
So when I first saw the timeline, I have to say it was pretty daunting. You bring this, the 15 people that we brought together, first of all, remember we're in a pandemic, so we don't get to meet in person. I knew half of the people had never met the other half, and we had to gel as a group. And but I have to say, I think looking back on it, I'm glad we didn't have more time, because it forced us to make decisions and it forced this conversation to happen. We didn't drag it out. The other thing I will say is we had, and I think probably everyone on that's listening has convened groups before, and your participation can be spotty. But I will say that we had almost perfect attendance with those 15 members at every meeting. And it was a short, I think they could see that this was going to be very short, very intense, but it wasn't a life sentence. They were going to be done by, really, the hard work was going to be done by December. And so I think people really committed to really thinking about that. We also did a lot of work in between meetings. People had a lot of reading. We with NCHEM's support, we asked for a lot of interaction. We would ask for feedback. We sent out surveys. We did a lot of questionnaires so that when we got to a meeting, we could really make decisions. We used the meeting time as real decision-making time, and we used the time in between that for a lot of reading and thinking about things. So, if you'd asked me in September if I liked the timeline, I would have told you no. Now that we made it, I think it was it worked. I also think that we in higher ed tend to like to process, and we like to take time. This is not a time for that. There's a lot of moving pieces right now, whether you're in New Hampshire, Vermont, or pick your state. And I think people need to respond. There's so much change that's happening. How do we be responsive? So it's forcing the higher ed culture to really think a little bit differently. But I also think, but we can do it. And I think we don't have the luxury of time right now.
Okay, thank you for that. So in looking at Vermont's plan and what was ultimately recommended, as I understand it, Vermont decided against including its community college system in the consolidation. So I wonder if you can take a few moments to speak to the unique role that the college plays in Vermont's higher education system and why the state chose to keep it separate specifically.
That's a really good question. And I want to start by, as I mentioned earlier, I'm president of the Community College of Vermont. So some people could think that, oh, it's because Joyce was on this and she wanted it to be separate. And I think Brian will support me in this, that I really wanted NCHEMS to do the data collection and come with their own recommendation to the committee and not be influenced by me. And I think Brian can speak to this probably even better than I can, but I think that the reason that there's several reasons that they wanted the community college system to be separate from the other colleges. One is we have a very different mission. At the Community College of Vermont, we have 80% of our students are part-time. The other 3 schools are residential. We also, and this has been for 50 years, CCV has 100% part-time faculty. And so, and it was, we started when we were created with a part-time faculty, because there was a belief if you are going to serve a very rural population and you're taking education to Vermonters and their local communities, you can't do that with a full-time faculty, because you might need a person, in the northwest part of the state, and you might need a person to teach English comp in the southern part of the state. It can't be the same person. And so really thinking about that, and that Vermont communities are incredibly rich. So we have a very different teaching model. We have our mission is very different than the other schools. And we just are set up so different. And the other probably most important thing is, I think Brian and NCHEMS would say that as they have looked around the country, when there have been mergers of the community college with 4-year or primarily bachelor degree institutions, that soon the demands and the expectations to meet your bachelor's programs quickly overpower and become the dominant force. And the community college mission and the community college programs they get sucked up into the needs of the bachelor's program. So keeping these very distinct was one reason. The other, I think that NCHEMS found when they did a lot of the data analysis, felt very strongly that CCV could stand on its own financially. And the other 3 schools, because we serve a lot of students, the other 3 schools, in order for them to be viable, coming together as one entity made a lot more financial sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. And I'm noticing our time. And Joyce, I have to just say, I am in complete awe of you right now, given you are the president of the Community College of Vermont and led this massive amount of work in the fall, which sounds like alone it was a full-time job. So just just really, really impressed and also very excited for Vermont as a state, and hope, these conversations can continue between both Vermont and New Hampshire, because I think we have a lot we can learn from one another and also partner together. But on that note, I see Sarah Robinson, our senior project manager, back on screen. And while we've been having this dialogue for the last hour and a half, Sarah's been monitoring our Q&A. And I understand there were a few questions that may have popped up in that, some of which may have been answered so kindly by some of our panelists already. But in being respectful to all of our listeners and their time, I want to take a moment to see if there are any particular questions from listeners at this point.
It's been an incredible, just an embarrassment of riches listening to this conversation. So I can imagine folks are probably still processing. But if you have any questions, if you hover your cursor over your Zoom screen, you'll see the Q&A option. We'd love to welcome any questions that may have popped up for you.
And while we wait for some new questions to pop into that Q&A screen, and again, I thank the panelists for being so proactive and monitoring that and responding. I do have one question that I have held on to the end for all three of our panelists, especially since they bring different points of view. And that one sort of million-dollar question is, what questions should higher education institutions be asking right now that they are not?
I'm happy to jump in if you want. I think one of the most important things that higher ed institutions need to be asking is, what does, and there's no good answer, but what does post-COVID look like? Because I am a believer that, we know what pre-COVID was, we had developed systems, we knew what we were doing. Then COVID came and it was highly disruptive, but it also didn't last just 6 weeks, it lasted 15 months. And people developed new patterns. They have learned to access education in really different ways. People have gotten really comfortable with things that we never imagined that people would do. I think post-COVID is going to be as challenging as COVID, because I think we've got to stay on top of how people really want to access learning. And I think it's going to be very different. And so I think if we think that if we hung on through COVID and we'll just go back to pre-COVID times, I think we are mistaken. So I think there's going to be as much uncertainty and forcing us to be creative during post-COVID as we did during COVID.
Thank you, Joyce.
Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'll chime in. I think institutions really need to understand what makes them distinctive in terms of what their students are going to get out of the experience, particularly as it relates to the principal reason that students consistently say they enroll in college for in the first place. I don't want to diminish the role of all of the other outcomes of education, but I'm speaking about workforce and labor market outcomes for students and what makes them distinctive and an important part of their communities. And so that leads to questions about priorities, and how do they make those difficult decisions about how to step away from some of them as they think about how to be sustainable in a new era post-COVID, but also with all these demographic changes. And in particular, who are the partners that they're going to look to, whether those are employers or other institutions, state agencies, to do meaningful collaborations that deliver on the needs of students and the communities and the states that they live or that they are located within.
Thank you, Brian. And Michael, it sounded like you might have something to share as well on that.
Thank you, Nicole. Actually, I would concur exactly with what Brian and Judy have said, particularly around the ideas of collaboration and flexibility. I think that during, talk about the pre-pandemic, the pandemic and then the post-pandemic. I think during the pandemic, all institutions, whether higher education, nonprofits, K-12, all had to learn out of necessity how to be more flexible, more nimble, and more adaptive. And I think those are three traits that everybody has to carry forward in the post-pandemic higher education world. Students will be coming to the college doorsteps with different needs, having lived a different life than the students we've known before. And how higher education institutions and institutions like my institution at the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation have adapted to that will go a long way to determining whether or not these students will be successful in their programs.
So listening carefully and keenly to what the three of you just shared really brings one point to mind, and it may be bold to say, but I'm going to say it anyways. And that is, I think so often we've seen institutions of learning require students, adults, really enrollees to adapt to those institutions. And I think what I might be hearing is we're asking for the opposite now, that it's the time for institutions really to be looking at students, placing students front and center, especially in this post-COVID world we're just emerging into, and that it's the institutions themselves that need to adapt to the students. I see a lot of head nods there. Sarah, I think I see a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I know we have a couple minutes left, about 4 minutes left. So I want to give our listeners a chance to elevate their questions or comments.
Of course, thank you so much. So I have a question specifically for Brian. Allison Stebbins is curious, do you recommend the operational combination between community colleges and four-year state colleges, such as procurement, HR, IT?
Do I recommend the,
The operational combination between community colleges and four-year state colleges?
I am not, I think that there are multiple examples. This is maybe going to be a little bit evasive, but I don't know enough about New Hampshire to know whether or not and how it might make sense. I think that it's my understanding, which may be not completely accurate, is that the community college system and the university system have been looking into ways in which they can collaborate around some of these kinds of shared services. And I think they should continue to do that. In Vermont, we found that there are areas of administrative services that you would think would be relatively easy to combine and gain benefits from, but it isn't always so straightforward. So I do think that it's worth a careful look. And in some areas there are obvious overlaps, and in others, say that the research needs of the University of New Hampshire for laboratory space are not going to necessarily be particularly similar to the laboratory space needs in some of the community colleges. So and then that requires a way to sort of manage that if you're going to combine those functions, for example.
Thank you for taking that question. And I want to be cognizant of time. When we say that we end at a time, we're going to let everyone go at that time. So I think we have time for one more question. This is from Polly Ingram. Learning that many New Hampshire manufacturing companies need to hire with good wages and also offer tuition assistance programs, I'm wondering how you see best strategies for reaching high school students who may have previously gotten messaging from the culture about making a choice between college and this whole hands-on realm. I'm not sure who wants to field that question.
I can certainly take a stab at least one slice of it, and that is that I think in New Hampshire, our career and technical education system, our CTE schools, which are regionally based, and so school districts from around a region will send students to a CTE center for a program. They're amazing programs, but there are challenges within that CTE model that limit the number of students who can participate in these sort of career and technical exploration programs. I think we have a long way to go to opening access to those programs. There's a real natural pipeline, Polly, between our New Hampshire high school CTE programs and the needs of business and industry. There simply aren't enough opportunities for young people to participate, and there are hurdles and barriers for those who want to participate. They have to give up some things in order to do so. So I think we could certainly do a great service to our young people and to our employers who need skilled employees to see what we can do to bolster our CTE programs within our high school age group.
Thank you so much. We had 2 other questions, but we have run out of time, but I let those folks know that we have captured your information and we can follow up with you after the fact. So please, if questions pop up after you've been sort of ruminating on this conversation, please feel free to reach out to Nicole and she can field your questions to our panelists where appropriate. So my role here is finished. Thank you all so much for your time.
And
Thanks a lot.
As we close out, I just want to extend deepest gratitude again to Joyce Judy, Brian Prescott, and Michael Turmelle. I know it's not easy taking an hour and a half out of your very busy days, as you are all incredibly busy people dedicated to your work. So the New Hampshire Alliance, and also on behalf of our listeners, thank you for everything you shared today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
All right, if you'd like, you can leave the meeting and cancel
End it for everybody.
End it for all of us. Thanks, Nicole.